Welcome, everyone, to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with the wonderful, delightful, erudite, specialist, Professor Catherine Fletcher. Catherine, thank you so much for being here to talk about your new book. I'm actually really excited because, as I said to you before we start recording, this is not something I know a lot about. And I'm excited because I get to learn with everybody else. I get to learn something about your new book. So you have Professor of Renaissance in the Early Modern Period. You wrote The Beauty and the Terror, an alternative history of Italian Renaissance, Diplomacy in Renaissance Rome, The Black Prince of Florence, that book I remember, about Alessandro de' Medici. And now the firearm revolution from Renaissance Italy to European empires. So please tell us a little bit about all of your new work. Yes, hold up the book
Yeah,
for everybody
let me
watching.
hold up the book for you. This is the book. And actually you've given me a good way in by means of introduction because this book came in part out of a question that I got a little bit stuck with when I was writing The Black Prince of Florence. Because in that book, which is a biography of Alessandro, the first Medici Duke of Florence, ruled in the 1530s, one of my big sources, because there wasn't a lot else, was his wardrobe accounts. And so, wardrobe accounts in this period are not just clothes, although there's a lot of clothes in there. There are all sorts of furniture and other things, including arms and armor. And I discovered that Alessandro was a gun owner. So, as you do as an academic, I went off to the library and I'm like, okay, let me find a book that I can just like footnote to give a little bit of context on this. And I realized that there wasn't one. Or rather, there still wasn't one because I'd actually written about guns way back, a decade plus earlier when I was doing my master's degree. And I noticed then that actually they were quite under-researched, but I hadn't done much about it. So I came back and okay, it's been 10 years, still nobody has written this book. I think I'm going to write this book. So that was the start of the firearm revolution. It was just one of these things where surely there is more to say than what people have said about this object that is so central to modern life. And I mean, I don't know how it is in Canada, but here in the UK, I mean, guns are now certainly not all that common, but for a very long time they were. And, they've been identified as a sort of modern technology almost since they were first around.
Hmm.
I mean, you get these lists from the 16th century, people go, the key inventions of modern times are gunpowder and printing and the Americas. Oh, you didn't quite invent the Americas, but they like to say that they invented the Americas along,
Yeah.
yeah, along with guns and printing
Hmm.
and guns, both of which are actually invented by the Chinese. So, Europeans coming along and like to appropriate things. But to be fair, they did do quite a lot of development work on the guns. So there's a
So
lot
when
to
we
say
talk
about the gun
about,
in Europe.
we're going to talk about exactly how the firearm developed in a moment. But when we talk about the Renaissance, we talk about the Tudors or the Tudors, depending on where you're from, or we talk about the Medicis or even pe like big figures like Alessandro or even like Da Vinci. But what do we mean when we talk about the Renaissance? What is this great time period? What is it? Where is it? Why is it called that?
I mean, sometimes it's just a label that's conveniently stuck on a period which goes, from sometime maybe a little bit after Dante in Italy through to Shakespeare in England, and it's just that period of time. And sometimes it's more of a cultural movement. So the idea of a cultural movement that aims in some way to revive or reinvent ideas from antiquity. So there's a conscious harking back to a golden age of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and saying we are having a rebirth. Like that's what the word means in French. It's literal, it's a rebirth of this great classical culture. And that's what some of the Renaissance intellectuals are sort of saying about themselves, that they are doing this work of reviving knowledge that had been kind of lost in the medieval period. Now, any medievalist will immediately get very cross when you say something like that, that it's been lost. So, but that's what they claimed to be doing, reviving a lot of this great classical culture as they saw it. So there's two ways of thinking about the Renaissance. It can be a revival or it can be just a period. Certainly so far as guns are concerned. I mean, they're not reviving anything. The guns are not a classical object, right? But they're very present in this period, which is one of the contradictory things about, the whole concept of rebirth. I mean, rebirth of what? They can't even write gun in Latin. They're very worried about the fact that they can't write gun in Latin. All these Renaissance intellectuals are like, yes, thundering bronze tube will have to do because we we can't put a modern word into our properly written classical Latin. So they don't. Or they, come up with some weird metaphor or drop in the modern word and then apologize for their vulgarity.
is it Jules Michelet who was the one who named, quote unquote, named the Renaissance in his Histoire de France, or at least he mentions that. I think he popularized that word. And then
Yeah.
everybody just agreed that, this is the Renaissance. I don't think, pe obviously, as we talk about in our other programs, people who were living through these periods didn't say, I'm living through the Renaissance. They didn't know that when they were there actively doing the things. But this is just it's a helpful shorthand for this specific period. But you're right, the guns were not part of the classical period necessarily.
Well, no,
So,
and nor was printing, and
yeah.
all these really important technological developments you get at this time, they are not actually classical.
So what do we mean by firearms? Because obviously guns started elsewhere. So what is the timeline for gunpowder guns and how they came to Europe?
So around about the beginning of the 14th century, 1320s, we get the first accounts of artillery in Europe, so siege cannons,
Hmm.
essentially. And as time goes on, guns get smaller and more portable. So, what I'm talking about with handguns is I'm talking about the sort of gun that an individual person can carry about with them. And those start to come in the early 15th century. So, the first time that they are recorded in Italy, so far as we know, is 1433, when one of the Holy Roman Emperors comes down into Italy for his coronation, and his entourage have got these new types of wooden stocked gun that are new in Italy. People haven't seen them before, and there's an account saying, how novel this all is. And a couple of decades later, we have Pope Pius II writing that the gun is a weapon invented in Germany in our time. So it's a small handgun. And these are the weapons that start to take off by the beginning of the 16th century as really useful military weapons. Up until that point, they've been a little bit of a sideshow on the battlefield, but armies and commanders start to work out how to really make use of them, and that starts to kick in with changes to warfare in that period.
Okay, and so where does the firearm come in Europe? Who became the major manufacturer of the firearm and who had them?
So we have two big manufacturing centres, one in southern Germany around Nuremberg and one in northern Italy outside the city of Brescia. Now, Brescia's nearer to Milan, but for most of the period that I'm writing about, it was under Venetian rule. And in these little valleys, north of Brescia, in the foothills of the Alps, we start to get an arms industry. And that's my main local case study. I think you could also have done a case study on southern Germany, but Italy is my sort of specialism, so I'm going to start there. And we get particular environmental factors favouring the development of gun production in this particular place, which is called, well, Val Trompia, Gardone Val Trompia in particular. It's in a steep-sided valley with iron mines nearby. So you've got iron ore, you've got wood on the valleys for smelting into charcoal and then to smelt the iron ore. And you've got a river, and the river allows you to operate mills to hammer the iron into the kind of plates that will then be rolled up to make the gun barrels. So, the choice of where you make guns is quite heavily determined by environmental factors, but also by the fact that close by you've got a relatively wealthy power that wants arms both for itself, for its naval battles in particular in terms of Venice,
Mhm.
but also for expansion into mainland Italy. So all those conditions are kind of met in this particular area.
It's amazing that it's so hidden away and yet such a big industry, especially at the time. So guns, though, were not only for the army at this time. Civilians seem to have them too. So who were the ones who possessed most of the guns when they were first being manufactured?
So they start off as primarily a military technology, but this is not an age of permanent professional armies. And from the end of the 15th century onwards, a lot of Italian states, and indeed a lot of states generally across Europe, start to organize militias. So when you have a militia that's primarily aimed at being able to defend the territory against foreign attack, I mean, those are ordinary people. Those are people who do all sorts of other jobs, and on them is placed a requirement that one Sunday a month they should come and drill with these new handguns so that they learn how to use them. And so militia service is a really big route to general familiarity with guns and to lots of people having them. And then realizing that actually they can be useful for stock control, for hunting, and well, also for crime sometimes. But really just they get used to the idea that there are these new objects and they can do certain things. And there are other incentives given to local people to try and develop their gun skills. So, for example, some of the Italian cities launch shooting contests in which you can win really quite a good prize by showing off your shooting skills. And this is very much played up as, an honourable, patriotic act to defend the fatherland from external attack. And given that there was a big set of wars going on in Italy from started in 1494, they continue on and off to some extent all the way through to 1559. So that's 65 years of warfare.
Mm.
There's quite a lot of incentive for people to learn how to use these weapons. So it's through the militia, through that route of civic defense that people get familiar.
Now I want to know about the prize. What could they win? What was the prize?
I mean, sometimes they got cash prizes, which would be several months' wages for an average skilled worker, so pretty
Ooh.
generous. And other times they got lengths of cloth. So, like the Palio, if you ever heard of the horse race in Siena, it's called the Palio, and that's named, and the Palio is literally a length of very expensive cloth. So it could be velvet or silk or something like that. And so you would actually get a length of cloth for your
Wow.
prize.
I-
And textile these luxury textiles are super expensive.
mhm.
So it's a very nice prize. And you could make yourself a shirt with it, I guess, or you could sell it on. I mean, depending on what you fancied.
So when we talk about all the wars in Italy, what constitutes as Italy at this time? Because I don't think, for those who don't know, I mean, Italy was not a one country at this time. So when we talk about Italian warfare or we talk about Italian guns, what are we talking about?
Yes, so Italy at this time was divided into five large states and quite a number of smaller ones. So the large ones are Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, which is not just the Vatican, it's a whole swathe of central Italy. It goes all the way up to Bologna, and the Kingdom of Naples, which gradually comes under Spanish control by the beginning of the 16th century and is ruled by a Spanish viceroy, having previously been ruled by an illegitimate line of the kings of Aragon. So the south of Italy is quite closely linked to Spain. Beyond those larger powers, you then have a group of smaller princes, so people like the Marquis of Mantua, the Duke of Ferrara, the Duke of Urbino, some smaller republics, the republics of Lucca or the Republic of Siena, which don't have a hereditary ruler in the same way. So a variety of political systems, a variety of sizes. Importantly for the story about guns, some of the small Italian princes operate effectively as commanders of private military companies and hire themselves out as condottieri, as they're known, to basically fight other people's wars. So you get the Duke of Urbino will be the commander in chief of Venice on a contract. And so there's quite an incentive towards military innovation in these small courts because these guys are effectively like the private military companies of their day, they are contractors. And so you want to compete, you do what the Duke of Ferrara does. And actually he is, I mean, he is considered a little bit scandalous, I think, but he actually goes down and works with his blacksmiths and talks to them about how to improve the cannon and gets his hands dirty and is always nicknamed the Gunner Duke because he's taking such an interest. And he has a couple of portraits of himself done, one by Titian, the original by Titian, and then some derivative ones where he's kind of posing with one hand on a cannon because he's so much, I'm the gunpowder guy. Like, look at me and my big gun. And so, um, interestingly, they're not so keen on being shown with small handguns until quite a lot later on. But that military innovation is definitely a part of the picture that the Italian princes convey to some extent. The guns thing is a little bit awkward for them sometimes, the small arms, because there's a whole thing about those being the devil's work and not very chivalrous and not very proper or gentlemanly. Like a proper man gets up there with his sword, fights like a man, not isn't shooting from a distance. It's a real problem that a peasant can, shoot a knight off horseback. It's a bit rude. And guns allow guns allow that, and they don't it sort of doesn't really fit the chivalric culture. On the other hand, they are very useful for your army, so we get this double think where people will be sponsoring a poet at court to say, oh well, guns are so ungallant and unchivalrous, and then at the same time be like, can I order some more novelty guns to give to all my friends? And this attitude sort of persists and persists and persists. Guns are the devil's work right through until the 20th century, and indeed probably to the present day. But at the same time, there's a sort of pragmatic view that you need to have them because of war or the potential for war.
How expensive were they at this time?
So, I mean, we're probably talking about a month or two's wages for a soldier, but it's not so straightforward as that because, I mean, for one thing, soldiers will often theoretically be expected to provide their own gun, but actually what happens is they get one from a central store and then it's gradually deducted from their wages. So there's a lot of credit in this economy, which makes prices quite hard to calculate. And there are also other ways of getting guns. So I have some guys in my book who have borrowed them from the local militia store to take to a party. I have, I mean, there are lots of rules saying that soldiers must not gamble their guns. So that kind of suggests they were gambling their guns. Soldiers can't sell their guns. So there's clearly a second-hand market in guns. There's inheritance. So if a soldier in your household dies, you are meant to give the gun back to the central store where it technically belongs. But does everybody do that? There's a question mark there. So yeah, so there are lots of guns around, and particularly in these sort of post-conflict environments, there are probably ways of getting guns without necessarily paying the full price for them.
So when did the guns in general start to become regulated in this time?
So there's some earlier regulation around where you can have weapons that would have applied to guns from very early on, just sort of by default. So, for example, you are not allowed to have most weapons in markets, fairs, churches. There can be regulation of all sorts of weapons within the city walls. For example, can you wear a sword? Who can wear a sword? That's often determined by rank. On the other hand, pretty much everybody carried a knife because that was what you ate with. So a small knife, not a sword length knife, but there's a sort of ambiguous area in between. But the regulation on guns specifically really starts to come in. The first example we have in Europe is 1517. That's in part of the Holy Roman Empire. then in Ferrara in 1522. And these are regulations specifically about wheel lock guns.
Mm.
Now, a wheel lock gun is a type of gun that does not require a lighted match to fire. So, your earliest type of gun, you basically got a long piece of cord that is smoking at the end. You clip it into these serpentines on the top of the gun. When you pull the trigger, the serpentines lower and the lighted match touches the powder and the thing fires. With a wheel lock, if you remember those old-fashioned sort of cigarette lighters that used to have the little wheel that you spin and it creates a spark, well, they
Hmm.
basically work like that. And they've got a
Oh.
sort of spring mechanism where you wind up a little wheel like that, and then when you pull the trigger, it releases, the wheel spins, and that creates a spark. So these guns, like your old cigarette lighter, can be hidden inside your clothes. And so that's a kind of worry for social order generally, because that's exactly what a bandit or an assassin would do. So a lot of states start to regulate these type of wheel lock guns and say you can't have them in the city. In some cases, people can't have them at all, or they are controlled by rank. But it's a tough piece of legislation to enforce because people want to have them. They are quite expensive and they're quite tricky to maintain well, but they have big advantages for hunting. Because if you think about going hunting, particularly if you're in doing twilight hunting, a smoking cord has smell, it's visible
Hmm.
because you've got a red glow on the end, whereas a wheel lock has neither. And that gives you an advantage if you don't want to draw attention to yourself, if you're stalking whatever you're hunting. There's advantages to having a wheel lock. And so wheel locks keep getting more and more popular. And we see, for example, members of the elite owning wheel locks, exchanging wheel locks, asking for exemptions from the rules. So there's a great letter where Cosimo de' Medici, the Duke of Florence, is writing to the Viceroy of Sicily saying, look, can my merchant please be exempted from your gun laws because we have heard that Sicily is pretty much infested with bandits and he needs to have some outriders with these wheel locks so as to stay safe on your roads. And of course, that stuff then just escalates because you get people saying, well, I need my gun for self-defense.
Hmm.
And this argument about needing a gun for self-defense starts to become visible in round about the 1550s in some of the correspondence about requesting licenses to bear arms. In other words, my enemies have got a license, and although I'm a lovely, quiet, person who just doesn't want anything to do with this, I really do need to be able to carry arms myself, also the rest of my family, because my enemies are very unpleasant people and they are unjustly after me. And so please, may I have permission? And you get these requests coming in, which use a self-defense justification, even though at the same time, or more or less, in the same sort of generation, we get people already starting to write that guns aren't very practical when it comes to self-defense because whoever had time to pull a gun in response to somebody else coming in to shoot them?
Hmm.
It doesn't work. But that argument about self-defense versus that's not actually realistic gun use is already going on in the third quarter of the 16th century, which to me is quite astonishing how early some of these debates about the practicalities of guns, what you can do with them, what you can't do with them, how to regulate them. So many of these things are already in play and known about, 450 years ago.
How little things change over time. How difficult was it to get a license back in the day? Was it something that you had to, I mean, were there different licenses for different firearms or in different areas? How did licenses work?
So obviously, if you're a member of the militia, then you'll get access to a gun in that role.
Hmm.
That's probably a matchlock, at least early on. By the end of the 16th century, some militiamen are using wheel locks, and that's getting to be more accepted. But early on, It can depend a lot about whether you hold office in a particular city. So there's a whole set of people effectively who are on the Senate of the city of Bologna, hold this city office, hold that city office, hold some, and also a certain number of servants each, because they might not want to carry their own gun, but they might want to have a couple of bodyguards with them when they're going about, particularly if they're doing something that might upset people, like a policing type duty. So they might not carry their own gun, but they have a couple of people with them who do. There's then all this regulation about people who are carrying guns in that capacity of servant have to be in the company of their master when they're doing it. They can't just take that as license to go off themselves and use this gun.
Mm.
Um, at one point, you get a piece of legislation coming in which says, by the way, the gun laws also apply to women. So I would love to know which. I have this suspicion some woman tried it on and said, nothing here says women can't have guns. So I just got myself one. So then they add it in. No, gun laws apply without distinction of sex. Do not try that, ladies. And then we have another one which says, oh, gosh, there's so many of these little sort of variations that come into this legislation, probably trying to close loopholes. So yeah, there are lots of ways to get hold of a gun. Um, there's also quite a lot of corruption in the system. So one of the things they do also in Bologna with the gun licenses is at a certain point they just rule that all the licenses to bear arms are invalid because people in the city hall have just been giving them away
Oh no.
orally, like just sort of essentially doling out like permission. And all these people are coming in and says, no, don't worry, like my cousin put me on the list for this gun license, so I definitely got one. And the officials don't know who's got one and who hasn't. And evidently there was a lot of that sort of corruption. So every so often they just cancel all the licenses. And that does have the advantage that everybody has to pay again. So the city council makes some more money.
Hmm.
And there are evidently lots and lots of problems around here. I have another case from Brescia where one of the constables who's meant to be responsible for the gate out of the city is caught up in a smuggling scandal and has basically fled because he's been caught smuggling a variety of goods, including guns, out of the city. So, this bribe an official is also a common way, I suspect, around some of the more formal rules. But yeah, people apply for licenses. I mean, sometimes there's some quite serious consideration given to whether they should get them or not, and sometimes you just think people are taking the money and
Yeah, they
handing out the
paid. So,
license.
so
Yeah.
did anybody have to present themselves to say, yes, this person, the name, the person is me. Here I am. This is me. This is my gun. This is the type of gun that I have.
Ooh, I have never come across anybody having to do that, but I think that these are often small enough places that somebody would know by reputation. I mean, we're talking about towns of tens of thousands, not sort of hundreds of thousands and millions of people where it would be possible to be that anonymous. I suppose you know what you could do to pretend to have permission from somebody from a different state. And sometimes you find that it's when people are crossing borders and they had license from one person, but now they've come into a different territory and they've got to transit that territory with weapons that were initially legal, but now maybe they don't have the right paperwork. That's when things start to get a little bit tricky. And actually, at a certain point, some of the city states formalized rules where if you've traveled with a gun because the road is dangerous, that's kind of understandable. They actually have a system of deposit at the gates. So you hand in your gun at the city gate, you get a ticket, and then when you're leaving the city again, you can get your gun back, but you can't have your gun when you're inside the city. And
And
this is the
so,
workaround that accommodates to dangers of travel.
so what happens though if some people, I mean, manufacturing is very different then as it is today. What do they
Mhm.
do if you're at the city gate, they collect 10 of the same gun. How do you know which one's yours?
Well, I think that people probably they could stick a label on it, right? I mean, so they could stick a label on it, but people do personalize their guns.
Hmm.
I mean, we have relatively few survivals of firearms from this period of the really basic, ordinary type. The elite guns are all very flashy, and you would be able to tell by the design because you probably have a custom design with your own details in it. But my suspicion is probably that quite ordinary people, if they were going to be traveling in those circumstances and they know they're going to be traveling, they would carve their initials on it at the very least. I mean, one of my favorite objects, which is not in the book because it would have taken me too much off at a tangent, is a powder box for gunpowder
Hmm.
made out of horn, which has this incredible sort of design of hell on it. But beyond that, it's also got a piece of graffiti about whose powder box it was and the guy's name and when he was exiled and so on. So people do this kind of thing. And I suspect there's probably more of it about than you think.
Now I wonder who is the man who was exiled? Was his name George? What was his name?
Oh no, he was called. I forget the full name. He was exiled somewhere on the Dalmatian coast,
Uh-huh.
and the inscription, and I think his name is Simon, but the inscription is in Italian, but a lot of the writing on this powder box is in some kind of Slavic language, which we were trying to work out exactly which Slavic language it is. Um, but yeah, that's a fascinating object.
That's
But
amazing.
I mean, in general, there are just yeah, a lot of very intriguing issues around the flashy gun designs as well. But I wish we had more ordinary weapons to know what exactly people did with them.
How did people outside of Italy and Germany in these areas, how did people outside of these areas view firearms at this time? Do we know?
I think all the European rulers were piling in there to want some for themselves. I mean, certainly in England, Henry VIII is importing guns via an Italian company in one case. That's the Bardi and Cavalcanti Company, which is associated with the Medici. They're from Florence. Um, they are selling handguns into the Tudor court. Henry also has shooting lessons. So, although, if you think about all the Tudors on screen, you very rarely see them shooting. But actually, certainly, by the 1530s and 40s, they were getting quite keen on the idea. So, they are buying into it. We actually have permission granted for England to export guns. So they get an export license to remove guns from Venetian territory to England, as do several other countries. That's part of how these governments were keeping up manufacturing capacity was by allowing exports to other places when they weren't at war themselves. So yeah, most places guns are coming into wider and wider use, and it's just a little bit of a matter of pace in that the places that are big theatres of war like Italy, like the Habsburg frontiers, the Habsburg Ottoman frontiers in sort of Central and Eastern Europe, those places people are most likely to be familiar with guns because they're using them very widely. And then by the time you get to the French Wars of Religion, into the 1560s, 70s, guns are just really common. Lots of people have guns.
And so what do you think that the legacy of guns in the Renaissance is today in Europe specifically? We know around the world right now we're dealing with all that, but in what is the immediate flow after this period?
So, immediately after this period, this is also the period of European colonization. And so, one of the things I write about in the final chapters of the book is how actually the use of guns in various imperial contexts, particularly but not only the Americas, conquest of Mexico, and also in West Africa, how the use of guns in those contexts almost helped to legitimize them back in Europe. Because you think about how Europeans have been conceiving of guns, there is somewhat problematic technology. They're the devil's work in a lot of cases, but because the imperial conquests are often justified by, we're taking the word of God out here to these poor, unenlightened people. Um, the gun then becomes an instrument of communicating Christian religion in this sort of quite weird way, but a way that allows you to end up with with people like the figure on the front of my book, and it's probably quite hard to see this, but this is actually, you can see like he's got wings here and he's got a gun, and this is an angel with an arquebus, and these became sort of merged pieces of Christian iconography in the Andes into the 17th and 18th centuries. And what they do is they put together these sort of military drill books and Christian art. And they sort of merge these two
So
things that
weird.
had come from Europe to create these angels with guns because, well, I mean, it sort of makes sense, right? Of course, these militant angels are going out and fighting for the church. And so they have the same weapons as the Europeans do, right? That all fits together. And so so one of the European legacies, I think, is to export guns, to actually use, I mean, to use control of guns in particular ways in their imperial project. So this becomes very apparent, I think, in West Africa, where there's a definite intersection between the gun trade and trade in enslaved people, but all across the world, like guns and access to guns and technologies become part of building diplomatic relations, sometimes in not particularly coercive ways, sometimes in extremely coercive ways. And so that next part of the picture, quite apart from guns just becoming more and more and more common within Europe itself, with meaning, you know, war becoming more and more lethal for the people involved in many ways, or at least, increasing the risk of lethal encounters when you do fight. Um, then I think, yeah, those are sort of two important bits of the big picture legacy. And it isn't really until, the 19th century that you get a serious effort in Europe to implement stronger gun control. You actually end up with a situation where there's an argument, but the side of the argument that you should generally allow people to have guns, or at least allow Protestant men to have guns in the English context, wins out. That's that side wins out, not without any restriction at all. There is evidence of ongoing restriction, but in terms of where you can have guns and what you can do with them. But yeah, I mean, guns really do take off and spread and are widely used. And it takes, I mean, I think it really starts to take the very strong states of the later 19th and 20th centuries to sort of say, actually, no, we are going to do regulation.
Not many people equate the Renaissance with firearms. I think many people think that these sort of things come in a little bit later in the early modern period. What's one thing that you would like people to take away from this? Maybe one thing that people don't know about this time period that you wish, obviously, the firearms is one, but that you wish more people would take away as a piece of knowledge to know about this time period.
I think, some of it is about the importance of thinking about what's not there in the evidence that you're seeing about, as well as what is there. So if we think about Renaissance art, in the Italian art of this period, there are almost no guns. It's really, really hard to find a gun. And that's not because they weren't there. It's because of a particular classicizing culture around the way that portraiture worked. We have a very, very small number of paintings from this whole period with guns, and they're primarily from Germany. So a one-off exception, which is a big portrait by Titian of the Emperor Charles V from the 1540s after he'd just won a battle against the Protestants. And in that, um, Charles has got a wheel-lock pistol at his hip. But even in that case, that's quite unusual, and it doesn't get copied by the Italian princes at all. They always want to be this chivalrous image. So I suppose one of the things to take away from this is what you see in the art of any given period is not the whole of what's going on in society. And that might seem an obvious thing to say, but you have to stop and ask that question: what's not here and why isn't it here?
Firearm Revolution from Renaissance Italy to the European empires, out April 14th for everybody. I recently I'd said that it was out in Canada April 14th because it's actually quite difficult for us to get all great academic books here, even the most popular ones. It's actually hard for us to get them here. So I'm glad we get it at the same time as everybody else. So for this book, how does this book fit in with all your other books?
So I suppose as I said at the beginning of the interview, it came out of a particular question I had about the sources for Alessandro de' Medici. And I wrote about guns a little bit more in one chapter of The Beauty and the Terror. So really, this has been taking what I could say there and going off to the archives and really doing some digging down into the documents and finding out what I could piece together from all these different types of source to tell a story that goes from the very local, in the first kind of couple of chapters of the book, to the very global by the end of the book, about what is going on with these weapons. And yeah, so it relates to some of the other books that I've written. It sits in the same time period. It's perhaps a little bit more academic than some of my writing because I'm trying to make an argument that relates to certain sort of theoretical perspectives like the military revolution and the civilizing process and so forth. But I hope it's accessible for people who are non-experts in guns or indeed in the technicalities of Italian politics.
So if you could just hold up your book one more time so we could show everybody that wonderful picture of that. I mean, the title is smashing,
Yeah, I will
but
do. Yeah.
I love the picture that you chose in the back. Is there anything else you would like to show for everybody who's watching?
I'm just
Ah,
going to
there it
see
is.
if I can put there's the kind of close up of
Fantastic.
um, the angel with the arquebus. Yes, the master of Calamarca, Aziel, fear of God before 1728, and that's from Bolivia. So yeah, I was very lucky to have to be allowed to have a very nice big set of pictures in the book. So we've got all those color illustrations.
Excellent. Is there anything else that you would like to draw people's attention to? Any lectures coming up? Any further books that you're writing now?
So I have been working with colleagues at Pittsburgh University on some teaching materials about early modern firearms. So I have a teaching module for anybody who is thinking of, teaching guns on a survey course for early modern Europe, doesn't quite know where to start. We have your back, and that site has now been soft launched, so it isn't absolutely publicly obvious yet. But if you are teaching on this topic or would like to think about it, I have materials about the gun control debates that went on in 16th century Italy. Lots of other colleagues have their own materials covering a broad range of humanities disciplines. So, yeah, that's something I just want to plug. And, feel free to get in touch and ask other questions. I'll be doing several more talks, including at the Royal Armouries in Leeds in the UK, and follow me on social media. I'm on Blue Sky mainly, occasionally on Instagram and LinkedIn. So, you can find me there.
Wonderful. Catherine, thank you so much for this. This has been such an education. I'm so thrilled whenever we have a guest on who tells me something I know nothing about. I always feel like I've received a college education in just an hour's time and really wonderful. I'm so looking forward to the book. Thank you so much.
Ah, thank you.